She was 8 years old, starving and invisible to a city that stepped over her every single day. He was the most feared man in Los Angeles, a man who had never once in 30 years said the word sorry. And on the coldest night of the year, under a freeway overpass where the world had quietly given up on her, those two broken people collided, and neither of their lives ever belonged to them again. 15 years later, that same little girl would walk into a federal courtroom in a $5,000 suit, carrying a single black case, and do something no lawyer, no lieutenant, no blood relative had ever managed to do. She would save him, not just his empire, him. But before we get to the courtroom, before the gavel, before the betrayal that nearly buried a man who thought he was unbreakable, we have to go back to a parking garage under a bridge in Koreatown to a girl who had already decided that no one, not even a stranger built like a nightmare, was going to hurt her without a fight. If a courtroom twist like this has ever kept you up at night, stay with me because this one earns it. And if stories about found family, second chances, and villains who smile before they strike are your thing, subscribe now, because Chapter 1 starts in the cold and it does not let go. Los Angeles doesn't do winter the way the rest of the country does. There's no snow, no ice storms, no postcard perfect frost. What Los Angeles does instead is worse in its own quiet way. A damp, bone-deep cold that settles into concrete after sundown and never quite leaves, made colder by the fact that nobody expects to need a coat in a city built on sunshine. At 1:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late November, that cold had settled hard under the 6th Street overpass, in the strip of shadow between two support pillars where the wind couldn't quite reach and the streetlights couldn't quite find you. Ryu Tae-sung was not supposed to be there. Men in his position, and his position, quietly, terrifyingly, was at the top of an organization that moved more cargo through the port of Long Beach than half the legitimate shipping companies in the state, did not typically handle problems personally. But the problem that night had been a warehouse manager named Dale Petrosky who had developed, in the space of one very bad week, a conscience he couldn't afford. Tae-sung had gone to have a conversation about that conscience. The conversation had ended the way these conversations tended to end when he handled them himself. Quietly, permanently, without a single raised voice, and without anyone in the surrounding 3 blocks ever knowing anything had happened at all. He was walking back to his car, coat collar up, hands in his pockets, running through the logistics of the next morning's shipment schedule, when he heard something that stopped him cold in a way 3 decades of violence never had. A child trying very hard not to cry and losing. He almost kept walking. That was the truth he would carry with him for the rest of his life, that for exactly 4 seconds he almost kept walking, because stopping was not something men like him did. Stopping meant seeing something meant it existed, and in his world the fewer things that existed the safer everyone stayed, but something made him stop, he would never be able to name what. Wedged into the deepest part of the shadow, where the concrete met the ground at an angle that blocked most of the wind, sat a girl. 8 years old, maybe 9. Wrapped in a jacket 3 sizes too big for her, with a backpack clutched against her chest like it contained something more valuable than anything in his warehouse. Her eyes found him instantly, not with the wide, helpless fear he expected from a child alone in the dark, but with something colder, sharper, assessment. She was doing math, calculating exactly what kind of threat he was and what her options were if the math came back wrong. "I'm not going to hurt you," Tae-sung said, which is precisely the sentence every dangerous man in history has used to open a conversation with someone he's about to hurt, and he heard how it sounded the moment it left his mouth. The girl didn't move, didn't blink. "I know," she said, "I've got a rock." She did in fact have a rock, a fist-sized chunk of broken concrete gripped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale even in the dim light. Tae-sung looked at that rock, looked at the girl holding it like a promise she fully intended to keep, and felt something shift in his chest that he wouldn't have words for until years later. "What's your name? Why do you want to know?" "Fair point," he said, and crouched down anyway, close enough now to see that her lips had a faint blue tinge at the edges, close enough to see the way her whole body trembled, not from fear, he realized. From cold. Straight, uncomplicated, dangerous cold. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded stack of $100 bills, held it toward her the way he'd have handed a tip to a valet. She looked at the money the way most people look at something venomous. "We don't need money," she said. "Not I. We need food, real food. Not something you hand somebody so you can feel like a good person and go home and sleep fine." Tae-sung, a man who had once had a business partner quietly removed from a yacht in the middle of the Pacific over a rounding error in a shipment manifest, found himself, for what may have been the first time in over a decade, without a scripted response. "We," he repeated instead. "Who's we?" That was when he saw the second shape in the shadows behind her, smaller. Curled against the pillar, wrapped in the girl's own second jacket, breathing in short, shallow pulls that made something in Tae-sung's chest go tight in a way he didn't like and didn't understand. "My little brother," the girl said, and for the first time her voice cracked just slightly before she caught it and forced it back into place. "He's sick. He won't wake up all the way." Before Tae-sung could answer, 2 men came around the far pillar, the opportunistic kind, the sort who prey exactly on scenes like this because from a distance they look like easy money. One reached for the girl's arm. T-Sung moved before conscious thought caught up with his body. It took 11 seconds. Both men were on the ground reconsidering several life choices, and the girl hadn't so much as flinched. She'd simply repositioned herself between the men and her brother, the entire time filing away everything she'd just watched with the same flat clinical attention she'd been giving T-Sung since the moment he arrived. "You're not a good person," she said once the men had scrambled off into the dark. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation delivered the way you'd note the weather. "No," T-Sung agreed, "I'm not." Her brother's breathing had gone wetter, shallower. And T-Sung, against every single instinct that had kept him alive and powerful for 3 decades, picked the boy up himself and carried him toward his car, the girl following 3 steps behind, refusing to let the gap close to 2. The hospital did what it could. It wasn't enough. 3 days later, in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and unfinished business, a doctor delivered the kind of news that arrives without warning and leaves without asking permission. Untreated pneumonia, too advanced, too long ignored by a system that had no idea a dying 6-year-old boy existed under a bridge, which was, of course, rather the entire point of bridges. The girl didn't cry where anyone could see her. T-Sung only knew she had because he found her afterward in a stairwell, dry-eyed and furious in the specific, controlled way of someone determined not to be caught grieving. He didn't offer comfort. Comfort wasn't a language he spoke fluently. He offered a decision instead. "You're coming home with me." "I don't need charity. It's not charity," he said. "Charity is what people do to feel better about themselves afterward. This is a mistake I'm choosing to make on purpose." For 1/2 second, something that wasn't quite a smile crossed her face. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me." Her name, she told him in the car, staring straight ahead at the freeway lights blurring past, was Journey Amara Bell. His men, when word eventually filtered through the organization, assumed poison, blackmail, a stroke. Not one of them guessed the truth, that somewhere beneath a bridge, in the middle of erasing a problem permanently, Ryu T-Sung had acquired something he had absolutely no experience surviving. A daughter who would spend the next 15 years informing him, in increasingly precise language, that everything he had built was built on a foundation that would eventually collapse. He had no way of knowing it yet, but that night, he had made the only deal of his career he would never be able to walk away from. Journey's first year in the Ryu household was less an adoption and more a prolonged, extremely well-mannered standoff. The house itself seemed engineered to intimidate, a hillside property in Bel Air with floor-to-ceiling windows, marble that had been polished to the point of hostility, and art on the walls worth more than the entire block she'd grown up on. Staff moved through the rooms with the trained invisibility of people paid very well to notice nothing. Journey noticed everything. She cataloged the security details stationed at doors that supposedly led to nothing important. She noticed which rooms went quiet the moment she entered them. She noticed that her new father's business associates wore extremely expensive suits and extremely nervous smiles, and that the import consulting company listed on the paperwork in his home office didn't. As far as she could tell from the one afternoon she'd spent quietly reading through his files, while he was on a call, consult on anything at all. She was 11 when she finally said something about it, at dinner, in the same tone she might use to announce a fact about the solar system. "You launder money through the warehouse on Alameda," she said, cutting a piece of chicken with more precision than the task required. "The consulting invoices don't match the shipping volume. I checked." T-Sung set down his chopsticks with the careful stillness of a man buying himself time. "That's a serious accusation for someone who still needs a step stool to reach the top shelf." "I don't need the step stool anymore. I grew 4 inches, and it's not an accusation," she said. "It's an observation I'm not going to tell anyone." She went back to her dinner. That single sentence, "I'm not going to tell anyone," did more damage to his composure than any threat a rival syndicate had ever managed to land. He responded the way he responded to most things that unsettled him, by throwing resources at the problem until the discomfort dissolved. He hired tutors, then better tutors. When she outpaced those within a year, he found university professors willing to teach a 12-year-old graduate-level material for consulting fees that made even his accountants blink. He told himself it was about opportunity. Late at night, on the rare occasions he was honest with himself, he suspected it was closer to penance, though for what exactly he could never quite name. By 14, Journey had read enough constitutional law and case history to make his attorneys visibly nervous. When she sat in on meetings she technically hadn't been invited to. She'd stand in the doorway, arms crossed, quietly dismantling arguments with the calm of someone who'd already won and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. "Your business model is morally bankrupt," she told him one evening, doing homework at his desk instead of her own as she'd taken to doing more and more. "It's also just bad long-term strategy. Empires built on fear collapse the second people stop being afraid. You should read some history." "I've read plenty of history," he said. "That's precisely why I run things the way I do." "Then you read it wrong." He should have been furious. Any lieutenant in his organization would have paid dearly for a fraction of that insolence. Instead, he found himself fighting something dangerously close to pride, which he buried immediately. because pride was a liability in a house full of men waiting for weakness. She started calling him Dad around the second year, though the word always carried an edge, less affection than accountability, as if the title itself were a contract she fully intended to hold him to for the rest of both their lives. There were harder years buried inside those early ones too, years the tabloids never got close enough to see. The nights Journey woke up screaming from dreams about the cold, dreams where her brother's breathing never evened out, where nobody came to carry him to a car. Tae-sung didn't know how to comfort a crying child. He'd never had to learn. The first few times it happened, he stood frozen in her doorway, useless, until one of the housekeepers gently showed him it was enough just to sit on the edge of the bed and stay until she fell back asleep. He learned. Slowly, badly, but he learned the way he learned everything, by refusing to fail at it twice. There were harder moments still. The afternoon a boy at her new private school made a comment about where she'd really come from, and Journey put him on the ground with a single well-placed shove before the teachers could intervene. Tae-sung was called to the principal's office, expecting to be furious with her. Instead, he sat across from the administrator, listened to the full story, and calmly informed the school that his daughter would not be apologizing for defending herself, and that the family funding the new science wing might reconsider its pledge if the other boy wasn't the one facing consequences. Journey never got in trouble at that school again. Word traveled fast, even among 12-year-olds, that the girl with the quiet stranger for a father was not someone worth testing twice. She began to understand, slowly, that the same ruthlessness that had built an empire of fear could also, when pointed in a different direction, become something closer to protection. She hated that she understood it. She hated more that some nights, lying awake in a house with more square footage than the entire block she used to sleep near, she was grateful for it. It was around this time that Bennett Cole entered the inner circle in earnest. Bennett was soft-spoken, unfailingly polite, the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday and never once in 7 years raised his voice. He'd started as outside counsel, a sharp, Harvard-trained attorney who helped Tae-sung's legitimate businesses stay legitimate on paper, and had steadily worked his way into a position of near-total trust. Tae-sung trusted him the way he trusted very few people, completely and without examination, which is precisely the kind of trust that rots quietly from the inside without anyone noticing the smell until it's far too late. Journey didn't trust him at all. "He agrees with you too much," she told her father once, watching Bennett through the gap of a half-closed office door, his easy laugh carrying down the hallway. "That's called loyalty. That's called strategy. Loyal people disagree with you sometimes, he never does." Tae-sung dismissed it as a teenager's suspicion of anyone who got too close to her father. He had an empire to run, shipments to move, rivals to manage, a growing unease about his finances he refused to name out loud. Every time Bennett smiled warmly at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right meeting somewhere in the machinery of that empire, quietly, patiently over years rather than weeks. Bennett Cole had begun redirecting funds through a lattice of holding companies with names so deliberately boring that no one thought to look twice. Shell corporations dressed as legitimate logistics partners. Every transaction engineered, with the patience of a man who had never once been in a hurry, to eventually point in exactly one direction, straight back to Ryu Tae-sung's signature. Journey finished her final year of independent study at 17, with academic scores that could have opened the door to any university in the country. Instead, she made a request that unsettled her father more than any threat a rival boss had ever made against him. "I want to go to law school on the East Coast," she said. "Somewhere far, somewhere with real courts, not the version of justice you've been buying for 15 years. He should have refused. Every instinct that had kept him alive and wealthy for 3 decades told him to keep her close, keep her safe, keep her exactly where he could see her. Instead, for reasons he would not fully understand until 15 years later, standing in a courtroom full of cameras, he said yes. Journey left for New Haven 3 weeks after her 18th birthday, carrying 2 suitcases and a silence Tae-sung mistook at the time for simple homesickness turned inside out. A girl relieved to finally put a continent between herself and everything she'd grown up watching. He was wrong. He wouldn't understand exactly how wrong for another decade and a half. What he learned in the years that followed came in fragments. A law degree from an Ivy League school that stopped returning his calls the moment he tried to donate a new library wing in her honor. A name that quietly stopped appearing on any registry his people had access to. Silence, where updates used to be. He told himself she was building a life. He told himself this was exactly what he'd wanted for her. He told his men when they asked that his daughter was handling her own affairs, which was true, in a way none of them understood, and he wouldn't understand himself for years. Back in Los Angeles, the empire had developed a slow leak nobody could locate. It started small, a shipment manifest that didn't reconcile by a few $100,000, dismissed as a clerical error. Then a longtime partner in the Long Beach Port Authority stopped returning calls. Then an audit, quietly requested by a rival organization circling Ryu territory, surfaced financial irregularities so specific and so cleanly documented that they could only have been planted by someone who understood the business from the inside out. T-Sung brought the discrepancies to the one man he trusted enough to fix them. "Someone's been sloppy," Bennett said, reviewing the documents with the calm, unhurried concern of a doctor delivering test results he'd already read the day before. "I'll handle it quietly. You've got enough on your plate." T-Sung believed him. That was the tragedy of loyalty built without inspection. It works exactly as well as the person exploiting it needs it to. Over the following 2 years, the leak became a flood. Shell companies with forgettable names appeared in federal filings, each one tracing eventually inevitably back to accounts bearing T-Sung's own signature. A signature Bennett Cole had spent nearly a decade learning to forge, with the patience of a man who had always from his very first day in that office intended to use it. Loyal captains who would once have taken a bullet for their boss started finding reasons to avoid eye contact in hallways. Fear, once T-Sung's greatest asset, had quietly begun working against him because fear doesn't distinguish between a boss under siege and a boss who has become the siege itself. It was during this slow unraveling that Journey stopped answering entirely. No calls, no emails. Just an absence that widened by degrees until it became permanent, and a tabloid press that filled the silence the way tabloid presses always do, with cruelty dressed up as insight. Even his own daughter can't stomach him. Read one headline, next to a photograph of T-Sung leaving a courthouse for an unrelated matter, looking every inch the villain the story needed him to be. His men expected him to hunt her down. He'd crossed oceans for men who'd merely insulted him at a dinner party. Surely he'd move heaven and earth for a daughter who'd vanished without a word. He didn't move at all. "She has the right to leave without being chased," he told the one lieutenant who dared to ask. It wasn't resignation. It was the closest thing to respect he knew how to offer, the same respect she demanded of him beneath a bridge 15 years earlier, when she'd refused his money and told him, flatly and without apology, exactly what she needed instead. What none of them knew, what wouldn't surface until a federal courtroom in downtown, Los Angeles filled with cameras and prosecutors already tasting victory, was that Journey hadn't run from her father's world. She'd gone to learn a language sharp enough to dismantle it. Every silent year, every unanswered call, had been spent in law libraries and courtrooms far from home, studying systems her father's version of justice had never once touched. She clerked for a federal judge in New York who taught her how prosecutors build a case brick by brick. She spent 18 months at a white-collar defense firm that specialized in exactly the kind of financial fraud that was, unbeknownst to her at the time, slowly strangling her father's empire from the inside. She found the first shell company 2 years into her disappearance, buried in a public filing she'd pulled purely out of old habit, the same habit that had once made her catalog security guards at doors that led to nothing. The company's name meant nothing to anyone else on Earth. To her, trained since childhood to notice exactly this kind of boring, deliberate camouflage, it meant everything. She didn't call her father. Calling would have meant explaining. Explaining too early would have meant losing the one advantage that made her useful. The fact that nobody, least of all Bennett Cole, expected the vanished daughter to be the one quietly building the case that would end him. There were nights during those years when the loneliness of the plan nearly broke her resolve. She'd sit in a rented studio apartment in New Haven, surrounded by boxes of subpoenaed records. And some part of her, the part that still remembered exactly what it felt like to be a 9-year-old with a rock clenched in her fist, wanted nothing more than to pick up the phone and hear her father's voice. To tell him she was scared. To let someone else carry the weight for one single night. She never made the call. Not because she didn't love him, she understood, somewhere around her second year of law school, that she loved him fiercely and completely. In the complicated, unglamorous way you love someone who saved your life and then spent years failing to fully understand what he'd saved you for. She didn't call because she knew, with the same clear-eyed certainty that had once made her catalog security guards at doors leading nowhere, that if she told him what she was building, he would try to protect her from it. And a war fought to protect her would never be as clean or as final as a war she chose to fight herself. So she kept working. She took a job at a firm that specialized in white-collar defense, not because she wanted to defend men like Bennett Cole, but because she needed to understand exactly how men like him thought, how they layered their lies so carefully that even trained prosecutors sometimes missed the seams. She studied forensic accounting on weekends. She built relationships with investigators who owed her favors and never once asked what the favors were actually for. She became, piece by patient piece, exactly the kind of adversary Bennett Cole had never once considered possible. Someone who had grown up inside the very organization he was trying to destroy, and who understood its weaknesses better than he ever would. By the time federal prosecutors filed formal RICO and fraud charges against Ryu T-Sung, charges built on evidence so clean it should have raised suspicion in anyone actually looking closely, Journey had already spent 3 years methodically subpoenaing bank records across 4 jurisdictions under a professional name the tabloids had never once bothered to trace. She wasn't hiding anymore, she was aiming. The morning of closing arguments, the federal courthouse on Spring Street filled 2 hours before the doors officially opened. Reporters staked out seats like it was opening night at a theater. Rival organization members sat scattered through the gallery, not bothering to disguise their satisfaction, dressed for the occasion like they'd been personally invited to a funeral they'd helped plan. Ryu Taesung sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer seemed to fit him the way it used to, not physically, but in the particular way clothes stop fitting a man who has spent 8 months absorbing blow after blow with no way to strike back. Across the aisle, the lead prosecutor, a sharp, methodical woman named Diane Marsh, reviewed her notes one final time with the relaxed thoroughness of someone checking a bag she already knew was packed perfectly. The falsified manifest had been entered into evidence, the laundered accounts meticulously documented. The forged signature, verified by an expert witness who spoke with the flat, unquestioning confidence of a man who had never once wondered who might have taught the forger to do it so well in the first place. Taesung's own legal team had run out of angles 2 weeks earlier. His lead attorney, a genuinely capable man in ordinary circumstances, wore the particular pallor of someone preparing to lose gracefully, because losing was the only option left on the table. It was at exactly this moment, evidence stacked, verdict all but written, cameras angled for the shot that would define the evening news cycle, that the courtroom's rear doors opened. Journey walked in. She wasn't the girl who had vanished. She moved like someone who had built an entirely new person in the years since. Sharp charcoal suit, sharper posture, a single black leather case carried like it weighed considerably more than paper should. The room didn't recognize her at first. Taesung did in the half-second before his mind caught up with his eyes, in the way a body remembers a person before the brain finishes processing the shock. "My daughter," he whispered. And for the first time in 30 years, several reporters in the front row watched Ryu Taesung's composure crack in a way no amount of legal or physical pressure had ever managed. Journey approached the bench with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment more times than she would ever admit out loud. "Your Honor, I request to enter as co-counsel for the defense. I have new evidence directly relevant to the charges before this court." The prosecution objected immediately. The judge, visibly intrigued despite herself, allowed it, partly procedure, partly the simple human curiosity of wanting to know exactly what was inside that case. What followed over the next 2 hours dismantled the prosecution's case with the patience of someone who had spent nearly a decade building, precisely toward this moment. Forensic accountant's Journey had retained years in advance, testified to discrepancies in the forged signatures, too subtle for the original defense team to have ever caught. Bank records from 3 countries, obtained through channels the prosecution hadn't known existed, revealed the true origin of the shell companies, not Taesung's signature at the root of it all, but a decade-long pattern traceable to one single familiar name: Bennett Cole. Sitting in the gallery as a witness for the prosecution, watching his own architecture collapse in real time. Here's something worth sitting with for a second, you might find yourself thinking, watching a story like this unfold. How many of us have trusted someone precisely because they never disagreed with us, never pushed back, never once raised an uncomfortable truth, and mistaken that silence for loyalty? Bennett Cole's entire betrayal was built on exactly that blind spot. If you believe real loyalty means someone willing to tell you hard truths instead of comfortable lies, drop a comment and let me know. Because men like Bennett Cole are always afraid of people who ask questions. Sensing the ground shifting beneath a case she'd been certain of an hour earlier, Prosecutor Marsh requested a recess. The judge denied it. "We'll finish today," she said, and something in her tone suggested she, too, sensed the room had become far more interesting than anyone had prepared for. Journey opened the case to a single page. A wire transfer dated 2 full years before the first falsified manifest had ever surfaced. Sent from an account bearing Bennett Cole's real legal name to a shell company he'd assumed no one would ever trace back that far. "This is where it started," she said, loud enough for the cameras, calm enough that it landed harder than a shout ever could have. "Not with my father, with him." Bennett Cole's face, for the first time in nearly 30 years of practiced pleasantness, showed something the room had never once seen from him. Panic, unfiltered and entirely real. Bennett Cole had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of staying composed under pressure. It was, in fact, the exact skill that had made him so valuable to Taesung in the first place. The unshakable, soft-spoken lieutenant who never raised his voice, never showed his hand, never once gave anyone a reason to look twice. That skill deserted him entirely the moment Journey's wire transfer appeared on the courtroom projection screen. "That document is fabricated," he said, rising from his seat before his own attorney could stop him. "Just like the rest of this theater." "It's been notarized in 3 separate jurisdictions," Journey replied without raising her voice, which somehow made the accusation land harder than if she'd shouted it. "Would you like to explain to the court why your signature appears on a shell company, account 2 full years before my father's alleged crimes even began?" The gallery, which had arrived expecting a quiet formality and a predictable ending, had gone utterly silent. The specific silence of several hundred people simultaneously realizing they were watching something that would be replayed on every news channel in the country by that evening. The judge called for order. Bennett Cole didn't sit down. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, and for the first time the mask of soft-spoken loyalty slipped entirely, revealing something colder underneath, something that had apparently been there the whole time, patiently waiting for an opportunity that had finally, catastrophically arrived. "You think you've saved him? You've just painted a target on both your backs." It was in the years that followed the single moment most replayed in the endless documentaries and news retrospectives about the case, the instant Bennett Cole lunged toward the bailiff's station. Hand closing around a weapon, he had no legal right to touch 30 years of composure detonating in front of live cameras. T-Sung's instincts, honed over 3 decades of exactly this kind of moment, moved before his conscious mind caught up. He was half out of his seat, every muscle in his body prepared to do what he had always done when someone threatened his own, end it permanently, with the calm efficiency of a man who had made this exact decision 100 times before. Journey stepped between them. Not toward Bennett Cole, toward her father. "Not like this," she said, her hand flat against his chest, her voice steady in a way that suggested she had imagined this exact moment more times than she would ever admit. "Not anymore." The bailiff subdued Bennett Cole within seconds. It wasn't, in the end, much of a struggle, just a desperate man making one final, poorly considered choice in front of the one audience that would ensure it followed him for the rest of his life. But the moment that mattered, the one the cameras caught and replayed for weeks, wasn't Bennett Cole's arrest. It was Ryu T-Sung, hands still half raised toward a threat he would have eliminated without a second thought a year earlier, lowering them instead. Not because he'd been overpowered. Because his daughter had asked him to. For the first time in 30 years, he chose her rule over his own instinct. The courtroom took another 20 minutes to fully settle. When it did, the judge, visibly recalibrating an entire day's expectations, called for a formal review of the newly submitted evidence, with clear signals about which direction that review was likely to go. T-Sung didn't speak again until the recess, alone with Journey in a side room too small for the weight of everything neither of them had said in 15 years. "You built all of this," he said, not a question. "I built it because you were the only mistake I've ever made on purpose that I refused to let go to waste," she said, echoing almost word for word what he had told her beneath a bridge a lifetime ago. "You said it wasn't charity, that it was a decision. This is mine." He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't allowed himself to since the day she left, searching for the frightened, furious 8-year-old beneath the bridge inside the composed woman standing in front of him, and finding her there still, underneath everything, exactly where she'd always been. "I didn't come back to save your empire," she added, quieter now. "I came back to save you from it." The verdict came 4 days later, though by then it had become something of a formality, the legal equivalent of a coroner confirming what everyone in the room already knew. Ryu T-Sung was cleared of every charge tied to the falsified manifests and the laundered accounts. Bennett Cole, facing an entirely different set of federal charges now, would eventually sit in a courtroom with far fewer cameras and far less sympathy than he'd once commanded. The empire, however, did not simply return to what it had been. That was Journey made clear within hours of the verdict, never on the table. "You're free," she told her father. The two of them sat in his office for the first time in 15 years, the room somehow smaller than she remembered it, or perhaps she had simply grown larger than the fear that once filled it. "That doesn't mean you get to go back to exactly what you were before. I built that business over 30 years. You built a fear-based empire that nearly buried an innocent man beneath it," she said. "I just spent 4 years dismantling the case against you. I'm not interested in leaving the rest of it standing." He should have argued. Every instinct that had kept him alive and wealthy for 3 decades told him to remind her whose name was on the deed, whose decisions had built the house she was currently sitting in. Instead, he found himself doing something he had done perhaps twice before in his entire adult life, listening. Actually listening to someone telling him he was wrong. Over the following months, the transformation happened in pieces, each one smaller and more mundane than the courtroom drama that had preceded it, which is, generally, how real change actually works. Not in a single cinematic gesture, but in a series of decisions nobody outside the family ever saw. Shipping routes once used to move product nobody wanted traced, were quietly redirected into legitimate logistics contracts. Front companies that had spent years laundering money became, awkwardly at first and then with genuine purpose, actual businesses, employing people who had no idea the payroll they depended on had once existed purely as camouflage. The captains who had avoided T-Sung's eyes in hallways during the trial found themselves facing a different kind of test entirely, whether they could survive in an organization that no longer ran on fear. Some couldn't. They left or were encouraged to, with severance packages generous enough to buy their silence without the threats that would once have accompanied it. Others stayed, discovering, some with visible discomfort, that loyalty built on respect required considerably more effort than loyalty built on intimidation, and produced, against every instinct T-Sung had spent decades trusting, considerably better results. Journey didn't take a role in the new organization. She insisted on that point with the same stubbornness she'd once used to refuse a stack of $100 bills beneath a bridge. "This isn't mine to run," she told him. "It's yours to fix. I'll help you build the structure. I won't be the one holding it up." What she did take on was the foundation, a community trust funded by the proceeds of the Empire's legitimate conversion, financing shelters and legal aid clinics across Los Angeles. All of it deliberately built without her father's name attached to a single building or program. "People should trust the work," she said when a reporter asked why, "not the name that paid for it." The press struggled to know what to do with a story that refused to fit the shape they'd spent 15 years building for it. A city's shadow king didn't have an obvious next chapter for a man who now spent his Tuesdays reviewing grant applications for a legal aid clinic instead of shipment manifests for cargo that didn't exist. Some columnists tried cynicism. Surely this was reputation management, surely there was an angle. Most eventually simply stopped trying to explain it and let the shelters, the clinics, and the employment numbers speak for themselves. T-Sung, for his part, found the adjustment harder than any hostile takeover he'd ever survived. Power built on fear had at least been simple. Power rebuilt on accountability required him to sit through meetings where people disagreed with him and weren't punished for it. A novelty that took considerably longer than he expected to stop feeling like a threat. "You get easier to work with every month," Journey told him one evening, reviewing quarterly reports at his desk, the way she once had as a teenager, minus the accusation that had colored every conversation back then. "I had a very demanding teacher," he said. For the first time in either of their memories, he meant it as a compliment, and she took it as one. Winter returned to Los Angeles the way it always did, without apology, without warning, cracking the concrete and testing coats exactly as it had 15 years earlier. The 6th Street overpass looked the same as it always had. Gray, unremarkable, the kind of place people walked past without a second glance, which was, of course, exactly why it had once hidden a girl and her brother so completely from a city that should have found them sooner. Ryu T-Sung stood beneath it now, older, coat collar raised against a wind that felt less hostile than it once had. Or perhaps he'd simply stopped needing it to be an enemy. Beside him, Journey set down a box of food, the way they'd done every winter since the trial. A small ritual that had started as her insistence and become, over the years, something he genuinely looked forward to rather than merely tolerated. "You didn't have to keep doing this," she said, watching him arrange the box with more care than the task strictly required. "Neither did you," he said, and yet she smiled, a rare, unguarded thing that still caught him off guard after all these years. A reminder of exactly how much had changed since a 9-year-old girl had looked at him beneath this same bridge and calmly informed him he wasn't a good person. "I was wrong, you know," she said. "That first night, I told you that you weren't a good person." "You weren't wrong, I was," she said. "I just hadn't seen the rest of the math yet." The empire behind them, smaller now, legal, stripped of the fear that had once been its foundation, had settled into something neither of them could have predicted 15 years earlier. The foundation Journey had built now funded 11 shelters across the city, 3 legal aid clinics, and a scholarship program quietly responsible for putting more kids through college than the tabloids ever bothered to report. Mostly because a redemption story, without a villain to sneer at, made for considerably less compelling headlines. Bennett Cole's trial had concluded months earlier, a sentence long enough to ensure the loyalty he'd spent 30 years faking would finally cost him something real. T-Sung had, in the intervening months, discovered an uncomfortable truth about the life he'd rebuilt. It was harder in almost every measurable way than the one he'd abandoned. Fear had been efficient. Accountability was slow, argumentative, and occasionally humiliating. In meetings where captains he'd once controlled with a single look now felt entitled to disagree with him in front of each other. It was also, he'd come to admit somewhere around the 2nd year, the first version of his life that had ever actually let him sleep. "I used to think strength meant nobody could challenge you," he said, watching a group of kids cross the bridge above them, oblivious to the 2 people standing in the cold beneath it. "You taught me it means being challenged and choosing to listen anyway." "I didn't teach you that," Journey said. "You taught yourself. I just kept showing up until you ran out of excuses not to." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that had once been a battlefield between them and had slowly, over 15 years, become something closer to peace. "Same time next winter?" she asked eventually. "Same time every winter," he said. "For as long as there's a bridge standing." They left the food where they always did, not as a symbolic gesture, not as an act of penance for a past neither of them could undo, but as a simple, practical answer to a simple, practical need. The same answer Journey had demanded of him the very first night they met. Somewhere beneath another bridge in another part of the city, another child might be cold tonight, might be hungry, might be doing the same silent calculations Journey once had, deciding whether the stranger in front of them was a threat, or, against every reasonable expectation, an unlikely second chance. Compassion, it turned out, was never the soft, sentimental thing people like to mock it as. It was strategy. Patient, deliberate, compounding interest paid out over 15 years, one decision at a time. Until a homeless girl beneath a bridge and the man who once terrified an entire city had built together something considerably stronger than either fear or forgiveness alone. It was simply the only kind of empire actually built to last. If this story moved you, if you believe redemption has to be earned, not given, and that real family is a choice people make for each other every single day, let me know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's another one waiting for you next week.